Sega Youth Forum, day one. Ben Jacobs with you. A very good afternoon or good morning if you're in North America, potentially, depending on where you are, of course, midday in New York. It's been great to have your company throughout the day. We've tackled all kinds of topics. The focus, if you are just joining us, is to showcase talent within the sporting industry, predominantly under the age of 30. I'm therefore just going to say I am 30, and you can make your own judgment on that one. A few little filters here and there, and I could probably put it off. Stand with Sega is their hashtag, though, via Twitter or Insta stories as well. We'd like you to tag us and we'll share and engage with you. And just want to mark your card about tomorrow. We've got another big lineup. We start with a special session at 9:30 GMT. And amongst the speakers throughout the day, Louis Saha, co-founder of Axis Stars. We'll hear from the other co-founder, Kate Hamer, in just a moment. Saha, of course, playing for France and Manchester United, amongst others. We'll also have a fireside chat with Daria Klishina, the only clean athlete representing Russia at Rio 2016. And in addition to that, we've got a number of our Sega Youth Council members involved. So stand with Sega, please do get involved. It promises to be a wonderful second day, and all the panels will be available on YouTube as well over the course of the coming days as well. We've had over 500 delegates already from all around the world. Do tweet us and tell us exactly where you are watching from. So we're going to turn our attention in about 5 minutes time or so to our next session. You're stuck with me, unfortunately, as the moderator, but it's a great title and panel. It's called The Power of Technology, Social Media and Digital. I'll introduce the team in a moment, but we were also supposed to have a very special guest and an athlete-led perspective in the form of Flo Williams, who is a professional rugby union player for Wasps Ladies and also a director at the Perception Agency, but she was training, so ultimately we had to let rugby trump the Sega Youth Forum. But she's been kind enough to dial in a little bit earlier and send us a video message on this topic and talk more generally about her involvement with Sega. So let's hear from Flo Williams now, and then we'll get this panel underway.
Thank you, Ben. So yeah, sorry I couldn't be there tonight, but got a couple things that I'd like to add if you hear me out. So yeah, with female athletes and trying to change the perception of them through media, social media specifically, and digital channels, there's such an opportunity there, because as long as you've got a phone, access to the internet and a social media account, you've potentially got a platform where you can share your stories and what you want to say quite publicly. The digital landscape, it doesn't discriminate between gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity or ability. If you've got something that you want to say, you've got the opportunity to build an audience and to build a platform for yourself to say that. And in women's sport, it's so important that we're getting these stories and these ideas out there and having that opportunity. Something that I did last year was calling out what Canterbury did when they launched the new Irish jersey. And it started as simply as putting out a tweet as questioning why they didn't use the female players when they launched the jersey, but they used the male players and they used models for the female jersey. And pretty much within 48 hours, this tweet had gone like relatively viral within the rugby world, and that created a little bit of a movement as to why female athletes, the players themselves, weren't enough. And it means that we don't have to rely on our sporting governing bodies, we don't have to rely on our teams, and we don't have to rely on brands to back us, but we've actually got a platform out there to change how people were perceiving us and to question things. And more often than not, we're wanting to see athletes speak up. As you're seeing with Marcus Rashford at the moment, people want to listen to what the athletes are saying, and the more authentically you can present yourselves, there are an audience of people willing to listen to you. And female athletes, we've got, in some respects, a challenge on our hands is to change how people perceive us. So the more that we can create these conversations ourselves and build our own personal brands via social media, the more likely we are going to change that mentality and society's perception of us as female athletes. Alongside that, influencer marketing is the fastest growing form of marketing in the world currently. So more and more brands are using individuals to help market their products. that means that brands are seeing the value rather than traditional forms of media, where it be TV, out of home, or newspaper advertising, but using athletes' individual social media accounts to promote their goods is one of the fastest ways to build an audience and to grow a brand's perception. And with over 80% of women using social media for purchasing advice, and athletes having a brilliant reputation in the media as role models and trustworthy, these are all values that brands would need to associate with to resonate with their audience. So there's a huge opportunity going forward to use more female athletes in influencer marketing, and that in itself will grow trust within brands, because you're using women and you're using athletes who are seen to be hardworking and loyal and trustworthy. But also for the female athletes themselves, they're growing their own personal profiles by having this association and the backing of brands, which will be really key in growing their own profiles, the sports profile, and then changing the perception of women's sport as a whole, including lifting the exposure from what we normally get to what we will be getting in a few years' time. More and more you're seeing that the following of the individual athletes themselves is actually bigger than the sport. So for example, you've got Cristiano Ronaldo, who I know is slightly godlike in terms of sport, but he's got 260 million followers approximately on Instagram. That is in total more than the combined following of every single Premier League club in the UK. Now imagine an individual player having this much power. Because of his personal brand, he actually can speak to a huge audience of people. And it shows that the digital and the social media side of people's brand, rather than just going out and performing on a weekend or being on TV, but the personal brand that you can create alongside your sport, can actually be more powerful and give you more leverage as an athlete to build your profile, to say what you want to say, to create change, etc. And if the more female athletes can individually grow their own followings, then our audience levels, they increase dramatically, and fans want to engage with the person behind the team, but the athlete behind the jersey. They want the inside stories, they want the behind the scenes, they want to see what your game day prep is, they want to see how you've achieved what you achieve and what you're actually like as a person, not the post-game interview version and the very well media trained version of yourself. And if female athletes can use that to their advantage, then the more individual stories you can get across. And in some cases, the behind the scenes stories of the female athletes is actually a lot more interesting and engaging than potentially some of their male counterparts, because you've got athletes who were working in A&E departments, you've got athletes that are working in the government, you've got accountants, you've got lawyers, you've got all sorts of these dual careers going on, and they've got families, or they have to get up and train earlier, and they don't have necessarily a set routine that you see replicated in every other player across their league. Every single experience and agenda of a female athlete is going to be unique to them, because the barriers and the adversity we have to overcome to achieve what we achieve is a lot more diverse than what the average male athlete would have to go through. And social media is a brilliant way of harboring that content and making it engaging to a much bigger audience rather than keeping it to yourself. It creates role models and it creates stories alongside the athlete. No longer are you ex-athlete who plays for this club, you're this person with all of these fantastic personality traits that go alongside it with you, and those personal stories. And once fans engage and brands engage with those personal stories, it creates a much more engaging product for audiences. Thank you, Siga, very much for the opportunity to discuss this, and back to you, Ben.
Thank you very much indeed, Flo. Good to have you contribute to this panel. And with that and some excellent and insightful opening thoughts, we can introduce you to the rest of the panel. The title is The Power of Technology, Social Media and Digital. And alongside me, we have Kate Hamer, the co-founder and COO of Axis Stars. We have Yash Shirtree, the project manager for consulting for India on Track, and over in New York, Blake Harwood, senior creative strategist, CSM Sport and Entertainment. Kate, I'm going to come to you first because I'm sure you were listening quite keenly to Flo, and some of the athlete-led activism, if you like, on social media fits a little bit into what Axis Stars do as well. So why don't you give us an overview as to your company, along with Louis Saha, former Manchester United and France striker, and then tell us specifically how you leverage digital platforms in order to fulfill your company goals.
Oh, hi everyone. So yeah, Axis Stars is a private community for professional athletes and entertainers, and it's a space for them to inform themselves. So there's like news articles that are fact checked in there, there's webinars that we run with various experts. They can find extra opportunities to generate income. They can network with each other, which is particularly important in terms of having all different sorts of sports and entertainment together, but they've got the commonality of that sort of transient career. You know, they get encouraged to focus on their talent, and other people sort of take control of everything else in their life. And it means that when they come to a point of retirement, they don't necessarily know what they should be doing, the right questions to ask. The team drops away around them, and they can find themselves quite isolated. So the stats are super high in terms of, on average, about 50% of stars will go bankrupt or suffer financial hardship within 5 years of retiring. So as Ben said, Louis Saha is my partner in Axis Stars. It was his idea based on his experience through his career, and then starting to speak to lots of other teammates and other people across sport that this was a common problem. And I think, you know, the mobile phone and having an app on your phone is something that means that there is much more transparency now, that athletes and talent can have that access directly. They're not having to rely on going through information that they're being given by agents or advisors, etc. They've got another place that they can check it. So I suppose in terms of the way that we're using technology, it's very much from that point of view, in terms of bringing transparency, giving them a place that, you know, I've worked previously at places like L'Oreal and Disney, and I would have always said any app that we develop should do one thing really well, and the Axis Stars app does multiple things, but that's the one thing that it needs to do in terms of being that single point of reference for pro athletes and entertainers to get the information that they need. And the longer view with that is, obviously, if they've got a supportive infrastructure around them and they feel confident in everything that they're doing, then they're in much more of a strong position to use their platform to speak out, like Marcus Rashford did last year and this year on the school meals. He's obviously, you know, got a very strong team around him, and so he can do that. But doing it just in isolation can be quite a risk for individual athletes if they don't have the support behind them.
And Yash, good to have you with us as well. I'm sure that a lot of what Kate's outlined in terms of transparency and education for Axis Stars applies to India on Track as well, because your company was set up to effectively instill a culture of sport amongst young people in particular, and give them learning platforms in order to participate across various disciplines. So do you think, because digital is still relatively new and a bit of a minefield, that it is that education element that a company like India on Track provides that helps protect integrity?
Absolutely, Ben. I think Kate absolutely hit the nail on the head when she said, the power that social media technology and these digital platforms have. From our perspective, a big part of our daily bread and butter is educating children on sport, not only on the technical aspects of sport, but also how do you use sport as a medium to develop holistic skills, life skills, soft skills, from an overall perspective. So educating our our kids and the children that we have in our programs is twofold. It's not only sports specific, but it's also life specific. And a lot of that today is through your mobile phone and through various social media handles. I was surprised when I saw how technologically advanced these kids are and know a lot more than we think they do. So what ends up, and we saw this during the COVID pandemic, right? It really accelerated our learning as to how deep rooted technology is in the daily routine of these kids, because we had to move our actual training programs from an on-ground setting onto an online setting. That threw up an entirely different set of challenges, but also opportunities for us. So I think it allowed us to pivot to a scenario where we were able to do a lot more in terms of providing knowledge on life skills, on lifestyle, on overall education, nutrition, and those sort of benefits, while doing the best we could given the platforms we had to provide sports-specific training as well.
Thank you for that overview, Yash. And Blake, to bring you in, I suppose your knowledge of digital and usage of platforms will differ wildly from client to client and brief to brief, especially in the creative field. But what do you think are some of the key tenets when using digital that are consistent, whatever project you're working on, to protect integrity?
So I'd actually, kind of refer back to what Flo mentioned in her sort of opening statement, and really just the idea of the power of storytelling. I think at CSM, we really try to lead with what's the story that we're trying to tell. Emotionally, how are we trying to capture that audience? Client to client, that's going to be different. And the platforms that we use, the types of stories that we tell are going to be different. But if you start at a point of sort of what is that overarching story that we're trying to tell, who are we trying to reach, and how do we bring them in? I'd say no matter what, brief to brief, that's really what we're looking to do. And that varies across, sports, that varies across brands, that varies across markets. But it really starts from, using the power of social and digital to access these new avenues of storytelling.
And Kate, breaking things down a little more specifically and starting with the pandemic, how do you think digital has changed as a broad landscape because of COVID-19? I would sort of argue we've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is Marcus Rashford campaigning for free school meals and succeeding. The bad is Leeds United piling on a comment by the pundit Karen Carney and forcing her off Twitter because of the sheer amount of sickening sexist comments below which they invited. And the ugly is me right now hosting a conference that in an ideal world we'd be doing in person. So how do you think the digital landscape has changed since COVID-19?
Big question. I mean, I think there's definitely been an evolution, I would say, in terms of people's awareness of how digital is working and stuff. I mean, certainly at the start of the pandemic, we were doing some webinars and things for our members where we were having experts advise them, because, for example, when sport completely stopped, the press obviously were still looking for stories, and there were quite a few instances of athletes' family members posting on their own social media about being with their cousin who was a professional footballer or whatever, breaking rules of lockdown. And even those kind of things were being dug up into stories because there was nothing else to talk about. So I think that was quite an interesting learning experience for people to realize it's not even just about what they're posting on their social media. They've got to think about the people around them, their friends, their family, and how that could have an impact on what they're doing as well. I think there's probably been quite a lot of opportunity for people to understand a bit more about the data that's being collected when they're posting on social media, how that's being used. Maybe more people have had time to watch programs like The Social Dilemma and stuff on Netflix. And I think that's quite an interesting trend now that people are more aware. I think there's still quite a lot of scaremongering where people get one bit of a story and sort of share that around. But I think there are positive things that the platforms are doing on that. I don't know if it's been rolled out completely, but I know Twitter were doing the thing with news articles where if they knew that you'd not actually clicked on the link when you went to retweet it, they'd say a headline doesn't tell the whole story. Do you want to read the rest of this article before you share it. So I think there are things that are happening to make sure that there is a bit more integrity on the platforms and more trustworthy information. But certainly going through the pandemic and all the sort of misinformation that could be shared that way, Trump obviously being removed from Twitter and all of the social platforms. I mean, personally, I'm not sure that that is a good thing, because I think, where do you drive that if you take it off a platform? Surely it's better that everybody's all in the same space and there's more opportunity for people to come across factual pieces of information. I know we're all sort of in our own bubble on social media anyway, by virtue of what we interact with, but I think the whole sort of who governs your feeds question is a really big one that's going to need to be addressed properly in the coming months.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And Blake, from a creative point of view, during the pandemic, has creative been forced because you can't go out and do big shoots and slightly more ambitious ideas? Has it become more emotive led, and has a message that perhaps was a little bit more unique become the message, as in you've been asked by clients, or you're suggesting to clients that they should play in to existing narratives around, for example, things like inclusion, Black Lives Matter, and so on? Because I've certainly noticed that across digital, that a lot of brands in particular, but even the odd federation and football club, seem to have played it safe and tried to amplify somebody else's message, particularly when they're outside of their comfort zone and they're perhaps having to talk about an unexpected thing, whether that's the pandemic or BLM. Right.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I would go so as far to say as, it's kind of been forced. I do like to think that brands, want to stand for what's right in society, and that's really the, driving force. But we're in such crazy times now where we're dealing with the pandemic, and we're dealing with, social issues that have never been as intense as they have in, however many years. So, but without a doubt, you're seeing more and more that, brands are stepping up to the forefront to lead these narratives hand in hand with, athletes as they're endorsing more than, and kind of taking on roles as becoming more than an athlete, whether it's, over here in the States, you see Kevin Love standing up for the importance of mental health, or Megan Rapinoe kind of championing diversity, equity, and inclusion from, her platform as a U.S. women's national team soccer star. And yeah, it's absolutely happening all over. I think from a creative standpoint, you always want to find ways that you can authentically tap into that narrative. It's not just about, slapping your logo next to a narrative, or just kind of, injecting yourself for recognition and awareness. But a good example that I can think of for that is kind of how Luna Bar, which is an energy bar here in the States, they actually, in the last Women's World Cup, they ended up writing a check to the U.S. women's national team to close the pay gap between what the men earned on the men's side versus the women's. And that's, I think, from a creative standpoint, it's really about driving that tangible action and making sure that you do, as a brand, put your money where your mouth is, and you're not just trying to capitalize on sort of social trends, because that's where you get backlash. And as you kind of think about this younger sort of generation, Gen Z, that's, always grown up in the landscape of digital, they're, more inclined towards a social kind of welfare point of view, and social issues matter for them. And so brands, to stay in their good favor, not that, they are just trying to what's the word I'm looking for? Basically, falsely try to enter this narrative, but they need to, stay in the good hearts and minds of this generation. And so continuing to understand where they can kind of inject themselves in these narratives is good for that standpoint as well.
And Yash, specifically for young people, how either during the pandemic or more generally as digital becomes more and more of a monster day by day, year on year, how do you keep focus? Because everyone's targeting young audiences, everybody's targeting multi-platform, everybody's targeting immersion. And what that means is that there's tons of different digital platforms, there's low attention spans. And what we're looking for from youth to promote integrity is ultimately focus, to ensure that they're taught in the right way, and messaging is actually seeped in rather than ultimately just seen and forgotten. And part of that is being able to hold focus of a young audience. So what advice do you have in that field to ensure that people are not just across digital through companies, brands, clubs, federations, and so on, targeting the right audience, but they're actually captivating, engaging, and holding the right audience for long enough to actually succeed in their end goal?
So I think, Ben, that Blake made some great points, because a lot of what we do at India on Track, and specifically the department that I work with, which is consulting, is we work with a lot of brands, right, to help them and tell their stories in the sports marketing space. And we also work with a lot of international rights holders who are looking to build their platforms in India. Now, let's skip back to pre-pandemic. Something that we always advised our international clients, whether that was leagues or clubs, is digital first, digital first, digital first, because that's the easiest and most bang for your buck way to build your footprint in the country, right? Fast forward, working with brands in the sports marketing space in India, I think one extremely important word that we need to keep in mind is authenticity. Unless you're backing a cause due to its actual reasoning and not piggybacking off it just to gain some PR mileage or some likes and retweets, I think people can see through that. And what the pandemic really forced us to do was keep us on our toes and constantly evolve. So I'll give you a little example. When the pandemic actually hit, there's a brand that we work with called Apollo Tires, and the first brainstorming session that you can say we had was all about digital first, right? What can we do on digital? And we ended up doing a lot of digital sessions, digital training camps for kids. We with partners with Manchester United, so we did some virtual fan parties. In fact, we did one just a couple of weeks ago with Louis Saha. Since in his role as a Manchester United legend, we allowed fans in India to interact with Louis via a virtual platform. So that's how we pivoted. But now we've come to a stage where we're sitting in January, end of January in 2021, where there's exhaustion. There's exhaustion amongst children who are consuming content and training via digital platforms. There's exhaustion amongst fans who have been forced to consume this over the last couple of months via their laptop or mobile screen. And now we're having to think that how do we create a hybrid model? How do we create hybrid activities for these brands to continue to engage this audience? And by hybrid, I mean a virtual and an on-ground hybrid activity that actually keeps them engaged, because we've reached a stage where after 8-9 months of virtually consuming everything, there's complete exhaustion. So luckily things are opening up, right, for on ground to restart, but that's something that's keeping us on our toes and will continue to do so for the next couple of months as things open up further.
Hey, I want to get your thoughts on athlete-led content, and obviously Yash just touched upon Louis Saha, who is relatable, is authentic, does a lot of stuff himself. But Alejandro Castillo has messaged in with a question essentially asking, what are the risks versus the advantages of an athlete running their own social platforms directly?
I would say, I think the main sort of danger and misconception with social media is because it is just on your phone and anybody can set up an account and you can just post. If an athlete approaches it from that point of view and just opens an account and posts something and doesn't have a strategy and a plan in terms of what am I prepared to share about myself here, and it doesn't have to, you see some footballers that are probably so nervous about it that literally all they're saying is can't wait for the match tomorrow, and then great match today, or we should have done better, and that's literally all they talk about. And when I'm working with individual athletes like that, I'm always saying, think about what it is that you want to do when you retire. If you want to get into nutrition or personal training or punditry or coaching or whatever it might be, then have a point of view on that. Now you can be posting that sort of content as well, and you're sort of building like your toolkit of an audience really that you can then take with you to whatever you do after your playing career. But I think you do need to be clear about what is it that I'm going to talk about. You need to be planning your posts and stuff. It doesn't have to be in a cynical sort of business strategy formal way, but you need to have an idea about what are the things you're going to talk about regularly. Are you going to do sort of live to camera pieces on your stories and things when you finish training or stuff like that? Or is it going to be more that you post about what you're eating or whatever it might be? I think that's quite important. I would actually say it can be more of a risk handing over your account, especially in football in particular. They might tend to hand to like one of their old schoolmates, or, you know, there's quite often the perception that someone young is going to understand the platforms, and it's true that they use them and they understand them, but they don't necessarily have the experience in like crisis management, brand strategy, etc., that if something did happen during a game and a player got sent off or whatever, you know, you've got to be careful about how you're going to respond to that and what you're going to say. So I think it's fine to manage your own stuff, but definitely have someone that you can have a bit of a sounding board with and get some advice and experience that way.
And Blake, how do you deal with a brand when they come to you for creative and they almost want to be pushed into a sport that doesn't quite fit? And even though that brand doesn't lack integrity, there's a sort of de facto lack of integrity between what the brand does and what the audience is. And, you know, the Super Bowl is a good example. Everybody might want a slot for creative during Super Bowl halftime. But I guess my point is, if that brand is marketing itself to young audiences and it's a betting brand, if it's a sugary drink, if it's anything that when used in excess, it needs a warning, it needs a messaging, or it might play on young minds in order to commercialize itself. But deep down, we're all thinking we don't want to normalize betting. We don't want to normalize unhealthy eating. But when Cristiano Ronaldo says, my sponsor's KFC, that is exactly what happens through no fault of the brand. And then you're stuck in the middle, having to have powerful creative, but be respectful of the fact that there are some warning signs. So how do you deal with that type of scenario?
Yeah, well, I think just from a process standpoint, where we always like to start is with kind of a brand analysis and audience analysis. You know, we're fortunate enough at CSM where we have kind of a whole A&I research team that can look at data, can understand, you know, if we're talking about a KFC, sort of who's their audience, you know, what media are they consuming, what sports are they aligned with. And actually we would start kind of at square one, to take the KFC hypothetical example, about what sport would make most sense for them to enter. And then once we kind of arrive at that, let's think about, okay, what's the kind of value add to consumers beyond just partnering with a Cristiano and sort of, you know, kind of basic endorsement deal? What's the, what can we create that's actually going to add a lot of value to consumers in the way that they're engaging with sports? So for instance, and through COVID, you know, as you were talking about earlier, Ben, and sort of the way that digital has changed through the pandemic, you're seeing more sports teams, more brands think about how can we actually elevate the experience of the fan through the pandemic, knowing that they can't be in the building. So for instance, the Golden State Warriors, which is an NBA team here out in San Francisco, California, they partner with Chase Bank to create a completely virtual experience around the NBA draft, which is when college players get selected to go to the pros. And, you know, fans were allowed to kind of go into the virtual green room with the Golden State Warriors front office. They were allowed to interact with the players and kind of have conversations on who the team just selected. So I think the way we try to handle it is, first, let's do our due diligence and understand what sport makes the most sense for the brand we're talking to. And then let's make sure that we're creating something that's actually going to add value experientially to the audience that we're talking to.
And Yash, talk to me a little bit about moderation and your views on how digital platforms should, when necessary, rein themselves in, because the expectation is as digital grows, you are going to be able to have immersive experiences, second screen experiences. You're going to be able to use multiple social platforms at once. You're going to be able to watch a game and do something else. AI is developing, and there's still that unpoliced element, as we've seen outside of sport, ultimately, as Kate mentioned, with Donald Trump and being kicked off virtually every digital platform. So how can you have your cake and eat it when working with clients? How can you give them everything they want, which is engagement in a variety of different ways, but at the same time stay true to integrity and make sure that there's moderation? Because that's the challenge, isn't it? That the more scale you have, the harder it is to police.
Right. I think the advantage that these platforms really give in a country like India, right, is reach. Being a country of 1.3 billion people, to reach that actual consumer via an on-ground platform is extremely difficult. Now, one thing that we have going for us in India is that smartphone penetration extremely high. So even in tier 2, 3 cities, tier 3 cities, even in villages, people have smartphones. And at the same time, it's one of the cheapest cost of data that you'll find in India. So everyone has a smartphone and everyone has data that they can consume things on. So the platforms definitely allow us reach, right? To communicate with them, to engage with them. Now, coming to your point on where do you sort of rein back, it's still in my mind a bit of a gray area. While we try to focus as much on engaging with these audiences via these digital platforms, there comes a time when it just becomes noise, right? There's so much happening on these platforms that it reaches a stage where it's complete noise and you're being blocked out. So again, going back to my previous point, it's authenticity, right? Build your community, right? And then talk to that community in the language that they want to be spoken to. Whether that's through digital platform or whether that's through on-ground initiatives. But I think finding out what your community is, and this is alluding to a little bit of what Blake was referring to, and then talking to them in their language will actually keep the communication authentic.
And Kate, do you think there's any newer emerging trends, whether out there now or that might come over the next decade or so, that are going to help digital be more defined or stabilized? Of course, every new platform would argue it's kind of its own entity as well. But if we look at the broad landscape generally, are we going to get security checks before people register to sign up? Are we going to get more verifications? Are we going to move into audio-led ventures as well, which means you'll be able to hear people, which is going to make it a lot harder to obviously hide in the corners? Are we going to have a better algorithm and design behind bots, so a lot more of them are actually having a positive effect rather than a negative effect? Where do you see the landscape changing in the field of integrity that's going to help things over the coming years?
Well, I think definitely, like I said earlier, I think people are much more aware now of what they are revealing about themselves and giving away in terms of data. I'm still not sure that people sort of fully accept that that is why the internet's free, and maybe the business model is going to have to entirely change if we don't want to be giving that amount of data away. I think that's obviously the biggest problem for the social platforms, is that they're now having to deliver for shareholders, and their entire business model is based on traffic and eyeballs and dwell time. And so it's not really in their bottom line interest to change the way that they are. But I think this year has shown that the platforms themselves are a great place for people to start to voice what is wrong and what needs to be put right and how things aren't being done in the right way. So they are going to have to respond to that kind of public pressure. So I think, I mean, I saw a futurist, I've forgotten her name, Tracy Follows, I think, years ago, and she was talking about how she could see a future where we each have our own terms and conditions, and it's the platforms that sign up to those, rather than us going and, you know, signing the iTunes agreement. I've probably promised them my firstborn child and all kinds of things. I've definitely never read it. But I think, you know, there is going to be a move maybe where people do have more ownership of their data. There's a a legal case that's being worked on at the moment around player data, and the fact that obviously all these companies are using this player data for betting firms and stuff, but there's no money coming back to the athletes for that in terms of where it's being sold and how it's being used. So I think data is probably going to be the biggest thing. I think audio is interesting. I mean, I've joined Clubhouse. I'm struggling to get into it, I've got to say. I think what my perception of that at the moment is, it needs a lot more structure to it. I think people are just sort of opening rooms and rambling on for hours, and not necessarily it's just like one long conference, but maybe that's the groups that I've joined and things. But you know, you're right that people can't hide their speaking, but you could also be anyone when you're speaking and there's no visual of you or anything. So yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting few years.
And Ben, I think just to kind of add on that, you know, from Kate talks about data, Kate talks about, you know, increasing in sort of audio and leveraging that technology. As we think about kind of the younger generation of fans who are coming up, who have been born with smartphones, you know, they're not as interested in watching a 90-minute football match or a 9-inning baseball game as, you know, maybe Gen Xers or baby boomers are. While these sort of new modes of technology maybe have inherent integrity questions built into them, they're also the same things that are being leveraged by properties, being leveraged by brands to attract this younger generation of fans. So there might even be a little bit of, you know, contrast or sort of reconciliation through the years that needs to be worked out there.
Yeah, and Blake, I wonder whether you can talk as well a little bit about not just when you put something on digital and how to protect integrity, but the actual production process as well, because another obvious aspect of integrity pertains to inclusion. Have you noticed before the pandemic, during it, or simply since you've started working, a clear improvement in the balance of actual physical talents used, whether behind the camera or in front of it? And how, when dealing with a brand, do you ensure that the message and the final output does reflect talent from both sexes, of all ages, of all backgrounds, different voices, and so on, to ensure that a brand, even if they say, oh, we're high end, or oh, we're targeting men, right, still doesn't forget people that perhaps a few years ago they didn't think was their primary demographic? Because it is an odd balance, isn't it? Because if a brand says this is our audience, it's very difficult sometimes to persuade them you need to diversify.
100%. And I think, you know, through the production process, through the creative process, that just needs to be communicated clearly, you know, early and often, that is a priority. And from a CSM standpoint, it absolutely is. And I think you're starting to see it begin to take shape, at least a little bit, through sports as an ecosystem. I mean, you see in the MLB just within the past 6 months, there have been 2 female general managers, you know, hired. You're starting to see more and more female kind of rise through the ranks of executive positions, but then making sure that translates, to the you know, creative that brands and teams put out is absolutely key. And it goes back to the point of just, you know, putting your money where your mouth is as a brand, as a property, and sort of not just espousing these values for, you know, kind of a PR engine, as Yash said, but making sure that you're really holding yourself to those standards.
Yash, I want to get your take, because you work with so many young people on betting specifically, because there's been a lot of talk that betting companies' advertising time should be limited, even though it often comes with the caveat of gamble responsibly. There's been talk football clubs shouldn't be able to put betting logos on their main shirt sponsor. There was a fallout during the pandemic when the English FA Cup games, some of them anyway, were only available on betting sites. So essentially it was forcing an audience, if they wanted to see those games, even though they were never entitled to get those games anywhere else, but if they wanted them for free, they had to go to the betting site. So we're suddenly getting these digital disruptors, betting companies, the Amazons of this world, pushing you over to their platform. And it always comes with a catch. Sometimes, of course, it's a good catch, but it's a catch. If you're watching the Premier League on Amazon, it's an excellent product, but you naturally could be susceptible to indirect advertising that tries to get you to shop. Nothing necessarily wrong with that, but it's not what you came for. And it's the same with betting. You want to watch the game, but then suddenly you're encouraged to bet. How do we protect youth against being lured into these areas too young and without proper warnings?
I think, Ben, the betting industry is a juggernaut in the sports marketing space. The dollars that they're spending, really, it's showing no signs of slowing down, right? So, in terms of protecting youth and the next generation, I think the thing we have to really, really focus and invest on is education. The more we are able to educate them about the reality of it, the more we will be able to protect ourselves. Because from my perspective, and I'll give you an example referring to what we have in India, is betting is not legal in India, betting on sport. And betting companies are not allowed to advertise in India either. But there's a catch. They are allowed to do surrogate advertising. So for example, if you remove the word bet from your name and change it to XYZ news, right? You can still advertise. So now we're seeing these betting companies coming into India and sponsoring teams with their logos on shirts, where their brand name stays the same, but they just change bet into another platform, whether it's a website, whether it's an app that's providing news, scores, articles, listicles, whatever it might be. But they are advertising, they are surrogate advertising without breaking the law. So I think from a legal perspective, yes, there is a lot of work to be done. But I think we would be better off if we invested more time in actually educating the youth on the proper way of dealing with these aspects of sport. I think we'd be much better off.
So let's just start up. Sorry, go ahead, please.
I was going to say on that, it'd be interesting, exploring a type of model where there was some sort of training or education class that needed to go hand in hand, kind of with the sponsorship. Or, I mean, in the States right now, it's the absolute wild west in terms of sports betting. It's a states issue in the U.S. So the individual states are starting to legalize, and the second sort of the ink is dry on the new laws, you're seeing all these betting houses just flock to the States, and they're actually starting to even set up brick and mortar sports books inside of stadiums. So it's just only going to continue to, I think, to grow as Yash says, and it'd be interesting exploring a type of model where a deal, a partnership, a sponsorship needs to go hand in hand with some sort of training or education.
Yeah, and on that note, Kate, wrapping up on Access Stars, what does the future look like for your involvement across digital platforms with your various clients? Because it's difficult, it'd be easy to say, here's how we get integrity, here's the best way of educating athletes, thanks very much. But by the time you've even said that sentence, Twitter may have released its fleets, Instagram may have reacted with another thing, 4 new platforms may have emerged, and in a year's time, what you thought was the best approach for that athlete might need to be retweaked. So how big a priority do you place on that digital education, and where does it fit into your overall strategy at Access Stars?
So it is very much about the education, really. Whenever anything new comes out on the platforms, then we'll obviously do summaries of that and stuff so that any of our members know about it. We make sure we've got an admissions and ethics committee. So Katie from SIGA is one of the members of that committee, and they review any businesses or partners that want to join the community, so we can be sure that everybody that a star can interact with within the platform is a trusted company, so they can surround themselves with the right sort of expertise and advice. And I think, like you say, it's constantly evolving, but it's just making sure they've at least got access to the information and can then make informed decisions themselves about what they want to do.
And Yash, Kate, I should say, mentioned Katie Simmons and SIGA. Where does SIGA fit into all of this? Why is it important when looking at digital and how to protect integrity to have an independent organization like Sport Integrity Global Alliance around and fighting on many fronts, including keeping a keen eye across what the best strategic approach is for digital platforms?
Yeah, I think what we have done in our partnership with SIGA and why it's so vital in a market like India is because it's growing rapidly, right? And we're seeing a lot of new leagues, new teams come up every day. And when you see such rapid growth, there always tends to be an innate want to sort of cut corners, right? Invest in more in items that are a lot more priority than integrity. And I think that's what SIGA and India on Track look to work towards, educating these smaller leagues, these younger sports properties to do things the right way and grow at an organic pace, because I think that's what's vital in the long run.
And Blake, finally to you, I suppose it's helpful, isn't it, when you're dealing with any client to be able to refer them to an independent, transparent body that sets guidelines that are universal and global, because then if there's any doubts, you as the creative can refer to SIGA or the client can, but either way, there's a trust there because SIGA is entirely independent and is sitting across many sports globally.
Yeah, 100%. And it's protecting a space that so many of us love. There, you look at just kind of some of the corruption or kind of negative backlash that can happen in sport, happen to the athletes that we love, and it's crushing at times. So this is a space that so many of us, I think, love, care about. It's the reason I got into the field of sports. And so to have an organization like SIGA that's defending it, that's standing up for it, that's making sure it remains authentic and pure as it just only continues to grow, it's vital.
Great stuff and well said. Blake, Yash, Kate, that is all we've got time for. We'll continue this on digital platforms as we engage with each other on social media, but it's been great getting your thoughts. I know that we'll catch up with Louis Saha, the other half of Axis Stars, tomorrow, so stay tuned for that. And there's more to come from CSM as well throughout this SIGA Youth Forum. But for now, thank you to the three of you. Thank you to Flo Williams as well. And stay with us on day one of the SIGA Youth Forum. Use that hashtag #StandWithSIGA to engage with us. And we'll be back in about 10 minutes time for some more information on the forum, and then I believe in half an hour's time at 6:30 our next panel gets underway, so do join me then. And as I say, day one of the SIGA Youth Forum, with day two getting underway tomorrow at 9:30. Our focus is on youth. We've got all kinds of talent from the world of sport and business and integrity too, many under 30s as well, and lots of insight and engagement. So do keep tuning in. It's the SIGA Youth Forum, and as I say, next panel starts at 6:30.